Thank you for joining us today. I'm Keith Tebow. We appreciate you tuning in to get an update on COVID-19 pandemic. As we have moved along and recovering from the pandemic, last week scientists in South Africa discovered a new variant called the Omicron variant. What does it mean? It's still in the early throes of learning more about the variant, but I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Erin Bromage. She is an associate professor of biology at UMass Dartmouth, specializing in infection and immunology. Dr. Bromage, thank you for joining me again. I appreciate it.
Glad to be here, Keith. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about Omicron. First of all, how was it discovered? And I guess, early on, what do we really know about the new variant?
Yeah, so Omicron was, discovered, was first identified in South Africa, but in reality, it was identified there because South Africa has such a wonderful surveillance system. They have done very well right throughout this pandemic of both testing, but then also doing a high level of sequencing of the isolates that they're getting. So, around about 2 weeks ago, on the 12th of November, they started to see it was a signal failure that was coming out with their PCR, where one of the genes that they detect was disappearing, but they were still getting positive on the other one. And they went, oh, this might be the alpha variant that we saw earlier in 2020. But they did the right thing. They went in and sequenced, found out that no, this was something new that we hadn't seen before. And then they essentially alerted the world. The thing, though, is it's very clear that it has not and did not arise in South Africa. It's just that they had very good surveillance that picked it up. It's more likely that it was actually circulating in a country that has poor surveillance, maybe some of the other sub-Saharan African countries where it was there. And then it's only when it hit South Africa, and particularly college populations, was it actually identified and then brought to the world's attention.
Yeah. So it may have started somewhere else. One of the things that I noticed was the expediency of this. So you just referenced it, that they have a very good surveillance system in South Africa. The word got out quickly. Is that going to make an impact as to what may happen with this variant moving forward? We know that a number of countries have blocked travel from some African nations. I guess, is the expediency of it, or the relative expediency of alerting the world, a good thing here?
Yeah, I mean, only if you do something with the information at hand. It's very clear that the variant is everywhere already. When we look at Scotland, when we look at the United Kingdom, when we look at Germany, Australia, anyone that's actually doing good surveillance is finding it. The US hasn't reported their first cases yet. I haven't checked the news this morning. Really, there's a couple of places in the US that is doing good surveillance. Connecticut is a great one. Somewhere between 10 and 30% of all positive cases are being sequenced, and they haven't seen it yet, which is good news. But it certainly is everywhere. Now, the travel bans are a little silly when you're dealing with a pathogen that's moved by people, and there are plenty of different ways to get to your destination. It was a smart idea to say, let's just do a pause for a while and stop the flood of people coming out. But a travel ban per se makes no sense when, South Africa has 4,000 cases a day and United Kingdom is having 50,000 cases a day of Delta, but we don't ban travel from the United Kingdom, but we are from South Africa. So there's a little bit of silliness there, but the alerting of the world quickly has been important. It's allowed people to up their genomic surveillance to see what's going on. But really, then it comes down to the governments and the people and how they respond, going forward, to whether it had an impact or not on the trajectory of what this may or may not do.
In some ways, we are still in the early stages of learning about the variant. But I know a lot of people who are following this, they have concerns. And some of the concerns, revolve around, I believe, three issues, right? How contagious could this potentially be? How sick do people get? Is it something that people may get a little more sick than some of the other variants? And three, what are the effects of the variant on the vaccines that we have received? I know there's been some reports that there's still more studies to be done from what we know in the early goings, how do we respond to those three questions?
Yeah. So what is important is what happens in one country is not necessarily reflective of what will happen in other countries. So when we look at South Africa, we know that they're only 24% vaccinated, but there's an estimate somewhere between 70 and 85% of the population have been previously infected on one of the earlier three waves. So there is a massive amount of community immunity there through vaccination, but primarily through prior infection. They've had an alpha wave, I believe a gamma wave, and certainly a delta wave already. So the fact that this new one has come out and is outcompeting delta, a lot of people are making sort of prognostication based on that it's better at outcompeting delta than delta. It's better at transmitting than delta, but we've already gone through a massive delta wave in South Africa. That actually makes sense that a new one comes along and would outcompete delta when there's already a lot of immunity to that. So it's really hard to tell. Fairly confident about the fact that it's as transmissible as delta, maybe a little bit more. The rapid rise, especially inside education, like inside universities, has been quite revealing how quickly it is spreading there. So it's almost certainly as transmissible as delta. Whether it causes severe disease, it's hard to tell because it's hitting a population with a lot of immunity. Early anecdotes were saying it was much milder, and that would be fantastic. But if you had prior immunity to a previous infection and you get infected again, we would expect there to be milder disease. So what we really need to look at is when it hits populations of, say, unvaccinated people or people with waning immunity, what does it do there? So we will know about that quickly. We are seeing a rise in hospitalization that is mirroring the infections going up. So I tend to think it's going to be roughly the same as Delta. The escaping the immunity is the one that's sort of got people most concerned, and rightfully so. When we look at immunity through vaccination or immunity through prior infection, one of the things that we do know is neutralizing antibody titers to the spike protein is really important. The higher they are, the more resistant you are to infection. And antibodies work in like a lock and key mechanism. They're really focused on shape. If the shape changes, the antibody doesn't bind, and therefore the antibody doesn't work. So, if you were infected with alpha, for example, or you were vaccinated with any of the vaccines that are out there, you have great antibody responses against the shape of the original spike protein. Along came Delta and changed, 10, 15% of the shapes on it with mutations. And that led to a reduction in protection of, quite significant, 20, 30% reduction in protection. Then, Omicron comes along and it's got 46 mutations in the spike protein, 26 of those being unique from Delta. That means that a lot of the shapes that are on that spike protein will not have been seen before. And therefore the antibodies that you've got to previous infection or antibodies that you have from vaccination are not going to work. There will be some that will work, but the majority of them won't. Concerning things for me is things that we do know already, is the mutations in the target region for the monoclonal antibodies, for example. They have mutated enough that those monoclones will no longer work as a treatment for people that are infected and looking to shorten the duration or severity. There are a couple of other monoclones that may still work. They're in different regions, but the amount of changes on that spike protein is the part that we have the greatest concern for, because we know that antibodies and the quality of antibody that you've got is a correlate of protection against infection against this virus.
So let me ask you, in terms of moving forward, I know the drug companies that have provided the vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and the like, they're already working on seeing how their vaccines can work against this. Is there a way for them to move maybe a lot quicker if there are a need to change the makeup of those vaccines, to do it in a manner that would make a positive impact sooner rather than later?
Yeah. So, I really do want to focus people's attention. Like, if Omicron becomes a problem in the US, it's at least 2 months out. It's not a current threat. The problem we have now is the current surge that is happening in New England that we need to focus on with Delta. So, the things that work, masking, vaccination, good ventilation, are things that we should be focusing on right now. But we should have, a rightful concern about, Omicron and look at what we need to go forward. So what we'll find in the next 2 weeks is that, Moderna, Pfizer, and then a lot of academic institutes will look at blood samples that have been taken and stored from the last year and a half, and look at, are people with an alpha infection protected against this? Are people with Moderna protected against this? Pfizer, J&J, do we have good neutralizing antibody titers? We should know that in a couple of weeks. But at the same time, we do know that there is enough of a change that an update of vaccine could be very effective if Omicron becomes a problem. And that is a big if. We still do not know, but we do need to get ahead of it so that it's there, because you're looking at about a 3-month wind up in order to manufacture at appropriate level, to test appropriately, and then to distribute and get it out. So it makes sense that Moderna has announced that they're in production of a variant vaccine. Pfizer has done the same thing. J&J is a much longer ramp up. They wouldn't be able to do it in 3 months, but they are certainly looking at this may be a variant of concern that may require a new vaccine for it. That wouldn't be considered new, but it would be considered retooling and retweaking your immune system to recognize both the old shapes that are still there, but giving you now the repertoire of the new playbook that the virus actually has. So if they moved fast, and as long as it was proven safe and effective, we could be looking at about 3 to 4 months if it is needed for protection.
And would that equate to, in effect, another booster for some people, for some members of the population?
Yeah, and so that's, the questions that will be answered in the next few weeks is, will the boost that people have got provide adequate protection against? There's 2 things they need to look at. Protection against infection is one thing. I think that will have diminished significantly. But also protection against significant disease and hospitalization. And I don't think that that's going to manifest in a big drop. Maybe a 20% drop, 95 to 75, but I don't think it takes us back anywhere near square one. So what we will find is it'll be starting to look much more like the annual flu shot, where you could consider it a booster, but in reality, the makeup of the influenza viruses that are inside the flu shot change every year to address the variants of concern that are circulating that year. So that's what we should see coming forward.
Let's talk a little bit about the current level of infection. We spoke earlier this summer about the fact that as the weather gets colder and people are heading inside, the instances of infection will rise. And we have seen that over the past few weeks, even in late October through November, as we're heading into the colder months. From what you've seen, Dr. Bromage, is that are the levels of infection and the increases we've seen, is it what you would consider maybe normal as we head into a colder time of year?
Yeah, so surprising to me was the rapid rise in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine that happened about 6 weeks ago and is still being sustained and actually going up. That was much earlier than expected, and had a lot to do with changing weather, but also waning immunity and 25% of their population still unvaccinated. So all of those things compounded together to result in the surges they're seeing now. We're seeing Massachusetts rise pretty much right on time. It started about the 15th of November. Thankfully, it's rising slowly, but we are at the exact same level as where we were this time last year in regards to number of daily infections. The big part that has changed, though, is hospitalizations. What we are seeing is much, much lower hospitalizations, and hopefully that manifests itself in lower death rates than what we saw in November, December, January of last year and into this year. So the bellwether for me, though, is really New York City and Connecticut. New York City infection rates have stayed very low, hospitalizations have stayed very low, and then Connecticut as a state is doing remarkably well and is being remarkably resilient to this latest change in weather and surge in cases in all the states that are around them. And Connecticut is nation leading in regards to vaccination. They also got hit pretty hard with infection. Most of their mitigations are dropping. So, seeing them not rising is actually really good news for highly vaccinated states that also have had significant infections in the first and second wave. So I'm hopeful that we're going to continue the path, lots of infections, but not leading to lots of hospitalizations. And that really is probably going to be the future that we're going to see for the next many years of this virus becoming endemic and being more of a pain. Yes, it will lead to a lot of loss of life, somewhere between 50 to 150,000 people per year. But we generally accept that. And I'm not saying this is a good thing. With influenza, a good year is 35,000, a bad year is 100,000 deaths. That's sort of where we are moving to, but we still have this big last wave to go through and then work out what happens with Omicron.
Yeah. So definitely a lot still on our plate as we look forward to beginning the year 2022. Dr. Erin Bromage from UMass Dartmouth, as always, I appreciate your time. If I don't speak to you, have a great holiday season, and we'll talk again soon. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Keith. I hope you have a great holiday season as well.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us here on FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. Have a great day.